The Farm Mudgegonga, Episode 6. Today's chat will focus on some history of what is such an interesting place. Good morning, Judy.
Hello again, Darren.
There's so much history here. I believe many years ago your great-grandfather came into this area with a backpack.
Well, perhaps we should go back even further than that, Darren, because there is so much history here, and one of the things that I think it's really important to remember is the history before my great-grandfather came, which was the Indigenous history of this farm, something we don't know enough about, but that we are starting to piece together a few bits, but I certainly acknowledge that they were the ones who were farming here first. It was their land, and there's a lot to learn from even the archaeological digs that we've been able to have around here and some of the rock art that happens in northeast Victoria and not so far from our place about what our Indigenous culture is. But in terms of this farm and our family, my great-grandfather came out from Italy in 1865 and they settled here. Well, the house was built in 1878.
But then so did Ned Kelly, do I believe. He was going to be through this area too?
Yes, well, we have our own Ned Kelly story, as so many farms here do, but that involves my great-grandmother rather than my great-grandfather. So my great-grandfather was Italian, Battista di Piazza. My great-grandmother was Irish, Catherine O'Brien. And it's lovely to think of them meeting up in Stanley when he came out for the gold rush, but the gold rush was finished and her family were coming through from South Australia to Yass. She was working in one of the Stanley pubs, which apparently there were many after the gold rush, and they met. And I love that thought of the Italian and the Irish meeting and how much emotion there would have been in that relationship. And they settled down here at Mudgegonga, and they had many children, of whom 13 grew to teenage and mostly to adulthood, although one of their daughters drowned locally at 12, and then the others, they lost a lot of their kids, which was really sad when you think about how much tragedy that would have been. But the Ned Kelly story, let me get back to that one. So I tell you that background just to say that when they were farming here, they had a very large farm in those days. They were farming some other farms as well. They had a lot of sons, a lot of daughters. The daughters used to do the dairy at the house, and so they were around the house during the day, and the men would go out the paddock and I hate to say it, probably chop down trees, because that seemed to be what the main income was from sawmilling at that point. I also know the boys did a lot of rock moving, because the house is built on amazing granite rocks that must have been carted from various places, and there's a lot of rock structures on the farm. But one morning, apparently, according to my grandmother, and it has been recorded in a number of books, a couple of fellows pulled up at the door here at the house here at the farm, and 3 came on horses, very hungry, very tired, and of course great-grandmother gave them some food and brought them into the house to look after them, and she said they were incredibly polite. They were also of Irish background, so I guess they got on pretty well. And she didn't think a lot of it, but as they rode off, she realised they had initials on the saddle blankets, which later proved to be police saddle blankets. And so over time it became apparent that they were in fact Ned and 2 of the gang coming back from, we're not quite sure, we think possibly Jerilderie, we're not sure, but came over the hills and were on the run at the time. And when the police did finally come and ask, did she see anyone with police saddle blankets on their horses? Of course, the answer was no. I believe, and again it's a bit of family folklore, that they were very, very polite young men, and I think that was one of those things that in northeast Victoria, why people talk about the Kelly gang and how much Ned was protected by the local farmers, because people really identified with him, and so many of the Irish settlers identified with that family and their persecution. I'm not saying he was a good bloke or not a good bloke, but apparently he was a very polite one.
And just remind us again, Judy, where we are. We're in Mudgegonga.
Yes, so we're here in Mudgegonga, on the farm looking out at the hills. Mudgegonga, northeast Victoria, God's own country, but then everyone says that, but I think in my case it's true, and in this very beautiful valley.
Now, going back to your grandfather or your grandparents, I think at some stage you mentioned they had a possible grapevine in his backpack.
So my great-grandfather came from a place called Grosotto in Italy, northern Italy, right up, in fact, on the Swiss border, as close to Switzerland as you can be. I've been to Grosotto. It's a beautiful village on the side of a hill, and you can see when you look around at Mudgegonga how, although Australia doesn't have the Alps that northern Italy has, there's parts of Mudgegonga that would have reminded him of home, and where we're sitting here now surrounded by hills, you can see that he would have, knowing he'd never get home again, having left at age 19, he would have felt familiar in these sort of beautiful hills and water and rock. As again history tells us, and the wonderful Sir James Gobbo wrote a beautiful paper about the early Italians to northeast Victoria, which is in the Italian Heritage Immigration Museum in Melbourne, and he says that he thinks Battista da Piazza was probably the first Italian into northeast Victoria. He came with his cousins and friends, so in the first group, some of whom are also settled locally. Next door here we have the Piney family, who are from, or the Pini family as they are called in Italy, from Grosio, which is the village next to Grosotto, and their descendants and us have been next door to each other now for 150 years. And the Cramerys, who was his cousin, who came out as well. So they were probably the first little group of Italians that walked from northern Italy to Genoa, got a boat to Melbourne, walked up from Melbourne to northeast Victoria, with a backpack each. And according to legend, he had in his backpack a cutting of a wine grape, because he always wanted to grow wine over here and wasn't sure he was going to be able to find any. And he did grow wine. He grew grapes, he grew tobacco, hops, grapes, lots of different produce here, lots of vegetables, and had a dairy. He was one of the first people to start the butter factory in Myrtleford, and very industrious man. But we still have one grapevine that we believe is from that grape. I'm not sure I'm game to test that theory, but anyway, it's certainly been there for my life, my father's life, my grandmother's life, so it's pretty old.
But for a majority of the time, has it been a beef farm?
No, well actually the beef part is quite recent. So he initially, as I said, had grapevines and had hops and tobacco. And again, Myrtleford area has been, famous for it's still very much famous for its grapevines, but was very famous for its tobacco industry, and still has a wonderful hop plantation at Ovens. So that was their initial, I suppose. Again, he was a sawmiller. He had a sawmill in Stanley initially, and then was still sawmilling in these valleys. He bred Clydesdale horses, and I think he bred the Clydesdales to pull the logs. So it was part of the whole transport of the logs and other things. And then they had a dairy, and like every farm, they would have been self-sufficient in a lot of things. There was a piggery and a stables and a dairy, and they would have had some beef cows, I'm sure, but they were in dairy right through to the 1960s, so nearly 100 years.
I know where the old dairy is, but roughly how many cows would they be milking?
Well, we've got some lovely pictures of them bringing in the cows, and I can't tell you, but they're a sizable herd. There looks like, well over 100 cows in that herd, and when you think about them all having to be hand milked every day. I was very lucky to overlap with my grandmother. She lived with us till I was 11. I think it was a tough life for those girls, getting up every morning hand milking cows. And then you've got to think about the fact that we had no refrigeration, so they had to not only hand milk the cows, they had to store the cream. They had these elaborate systems of wells and running water and rocks in cellars to try to keep the cream cool enough to make the butter that then the girls would take by horse and cart up the hill to Stanley twice a week, or to Beechworth, and that was again considered to be girls' jobs apparently.
Well, it's been a female farm, I think, for the last...
The girls have been very significant in this farm. So great-grandfather died in 1908, and my great-grandmother, the Irish Catherine O'Brien, ran the farm till she died in 1939. So she had another 30 years at the helm and was a very formidable woman. My dad, remembered her well. She was, again, that Irish-Italian family first, very Catholic, Everything was about family. So she raised those, not just the children, but the grandchildren. And my dad, being her grandson, he talked about she would have the grandchildren, they all lived in the old house. A lot of them lived in the old house together over the years. The women inside, the men outside on the veranda in sleep outs. And this is after they were married. And so the kids would be inside as well. And a lot of those grandchildren were brought up together as cousins. And she would sit on the bed reading the stories and doing the tutoring. And I can't even imagine how busy it must have been for them all living in the one house and doing all this farming. But she was a formidable woman who was always called Mater, which Mater being Irish for mother. And I don't think she gets the recognition she deserves.
I'm talking to your mum in a couple of weeks, so I can't wait for that one because we're going to dig up some old stories there. She's 93 and an absolute cracker.
Well, my mum's a ring-in, of course, so she's not the blood relative, but she's the one who ended up having to farm because it was my great-grandmother and then it was my grandmother. So very complicated story where all the boys in that family had their own farm, but the girls, 5 of the girls, got left just this home property, which at that point was 320 acres. So 5 of them sharing 320 acres where, even for one of them it wouldn't have been a farm. And it took a very long time for Grandma to eventually settle with all the sisters and their descendants and take possession of this farm in the 50s. And then eventually my dad farmed for a period, but he died prematurely when I was 17, and my mother had to take on farming, and then me. Or we did it together, and my brother as well. So it's had a lot of women at the helm and for long periods of time, and I think that makes it a bit special. My mother particularly, because she grew up in the middle of Melbourne and was always considered to be, this sort of strange city woman who'd turned up at Mudgegonga, to marry the local boy. Didn't quite fit in, I don't think, but when you see her at 93, she's pretty much the matriarch now. So she eventually learnt all the skills she needed to do, and she's the most fearless woman I've ever met.
Absolutely agree with that. So we're sitting here, we're overlooking the beautiful old homestead. Can you give us a bit of a description what it might have been like from your photos and so forth? 100 years ago we had some very clever wells and springs, and there were pigs and lots of veggies.
Absolutely. So we had we do know a lot about what it was. I said fortunately it's only a couple of our generations move quite slowly. We have got a good idea of what it was like, certainly in the early 20th century, early 1900s. It was a very...
They didn't have a posse track roaring around the background?
I don't think they had to cope with the noise of a posse track, but I think the Clydesdales were a lot gentler somehow. So one of the things to say about our farm is we've had, it's had 3 major fires, bushfires, and 2 of them have wiped out, well, the most recent Black Saturday, fortunately, only wiped out pasture and fences, 70% of the farm. But the fire in 1968 took out most of the outbuildings. The fire in 1939 started that process, but in 68 I think we lost 20-something outbuildings. We lost the stables, the dairy, the piggery, all the storage, all the things that made this place a little city when I was very young, and I have to tell you I wasn't very old in 1968. I don't have a lot of memory before that, but Mum certainly does, and it was it was a very different place then. I always think of it like its own little city. I said the great-grandparents had all these kids, they all got married, had their kids. They were all lots of people running around. They had their own tutor. The kids didn't go to school. They had my grandma called him the Scottish school teacher from Scotland, which is a bit of a double-handed way of saying old Mr. Brown, who I've got a picture of with his big snowy beard. He was the live-in tutor for all the kids. I have no idea what his story was. He lived across the road on a farm. He must have been some very strange hermit, but the kids seemed to have a pretty good education from old Mr. Brown. And then in later years they started going to the Mudgegonga school. I said they were very Catholic. The priest would visit by horseback once a month and stay and say mass. They had their own, I said, community, which at times was 30, 40, 50 people living here. And family was everything. So that you said they're very self-sufficient, and and they all worked very hard. It's changed a lot, but so in the last few years I've been here on my own. Since my husband died, my boys have grown up. I find myself on the whole farm on my own with my dogs, and I can only picture all these people that have been walking around and living here, and certainly in the house. I believe I see them sometimes, and they rattle around, but a lot of history.
I've looked at some of the wells, and they didn't have the machinery we've got today. Like, very clever stuff.
Incredible.
Clean the water. And
I think that goes back to great-grandfather and his Italian heritage. As said, he comes from a village where the village was on the side of the Alps, right up northern Italy, and the water would just rush down the side of the Alps, and they'd have to contain the water and channel the water all the time. And when I went over there again, I saw so many rock wells, things that I could then see he'd tried to replicate here at Mudgegonga to manage the water. And one of the systems is what we call the 3-well system. So he had 3 underground stone wells that were connected with running water through rocks so that they could use the underground cellar for refrigeration. And again, unfortunately, it collapsed in the fire in '68. So not that long ago, but again, Mum can tell you that she remembers walking into it, so it was at least 6 foot tall. And when we were digging some foundations here to build the social farm in the last year or two, we actually hit some of the corner posts that were underground that must have been these great big red gum posts that held up the ceiling of the cellar where the running water would go through, and they'd store all their food and vegetables. So ingenious, just incredible stuff that they had to do to manage the seasons and again to be self-sufficient because there were no shops nearby.
what's the building over there behind us still standing? It's quite old.
So there's only really 2 original buildings left. There's the house, the half of the house, to be honest. We're rebuilding the other half of the house at the moment as part of this new social farm. But the original old house, which was the bedrooms with the veranda, and then the other building that goes back to early days, possibly about the same time, about 150 years, is the cream shed, which was the shed that they would store the cream in after milking before they put it in the cellar. So it's a very small little shed that's falling apart a bit, but it's somehow survived all these fires and all the weather and turmoil of 150 years.
I think there's the odd tree too that have survived 2 fires.
The amazing thing is when you look at the old photos and you see something and you say, oh, it's still there, because not a lot is still there, and certainly these bushfires, because we're in this valley where it's a bit of a wind tunnel for a bushfire. The fire burns very strong and is very fierce, so it takes out most of the trees and fences, but there's a couple of trees have survived at least the 39 and 68 fire. And my favourite one is the one I call the resilience tree, which is at the front of the place, and it seems to be in every photo. And it's the saddest looking tree in the world. It's got a broken branch and a couple of black stump, but it always has a bit of green coming out the top. It seems to be defying age and any sort of turmoil, and it's actually the tree that we've put on our logo. So the logo for the farm Mudgegonga is a tree, and it is actually the resilience tree. And if you look closely, you'll see the broken branch out the side, and you can see the actual tree, and hopefully it'll continue to live the way it does and defy everything that gets thrown at it.
And Judy, do you have any other fond memories as a child growing up?
Certainly many fond memories. As I said, I do love being here, and as kids we were very much left to our own devices, but there was always something to explore, and sometimes you'll come across something a bit unusual. And one of the things that every time I see it I'm taken aback is when I go down the creek, there's a beautiful cluster of walnut trees that still produce walnuts, and they must be over 100 years old. And then down the other end of the creek there's some apple trees, again must have been planted, but they're now sort of in the side of the bank up in the bush. And I know the creek was very important to my grandparents, great-grandparents, because the great soil on the sides of the creek, the black flats as it's often called, was where they grew a lot of their vegetables there, potatoes particularly.
Because of the soil type?
Yeah, because the soil was particularly rich, and again they had water in the creek. There wasn't quite the the state permits that are required now to use the water out of the creek, which we do not use, but they were able to irrigate their vegetables, and because of that there's these beautiful nut and apple plantations which sort of come out of nowhere. They're in the middle of the bush because now we're not, no one's farming down there other than animal farming, although having said that, I'm about to finish a project fencing off the creek because I have a desire to protect the creek and that area around it, and we're doing a lovely regeneration project this year down there in partnership with the Catchment Management Authority to protect that very fragile area down there. So hopefully the walnuts and the apples can be saved as well.
Thank you, Judy. Always love our chats. We'll talk to you again in a week or two. Thank you.
Thanks, Darren. I love our chats too, but I worry about what you're going to ask me next. Thank you, Darren.